opportunity for validated feedback quicker, to make more informed decisions, and to be able to do it in a repeatable way. Again, what DA has within it, because it encompasses not only, again, content that was written specifically for DA, but all the other things from industry frameworks, and you'll see as we get into this a little bit more this morning, Scrum in particular, that there are a lot of similarities to how we're trying to achieve business agility. It's just with DA, we find that they've got the best parts and pieces that have worked very well and brought them all together into this toolkit. So one of the things that we see out in the industry is, to some respect, Agile has devolved into chaos. There are hundreds and hundreds of practices that are available from an Agile and Lean perspective. And this is just a very, very small subset of those. And within them, there is a lot of significant overlap. And at the same time, there are some significant gaps depending on the approach that you're taking. In addition, there's a lot of conflicting advice. There's not a standardization of terms or what a particular practice might be. And finally, there are a lot of what we'd consider niche certifications, right? There are a lot of certifications out in the industry, and in the Agile space, there is no shortage. Some of these certifications are quite easy to obtain. So one of the things that, through Disciplined Agile and PMI being sort of the platinum standard when it comes to certifications, there's been a lot of focus around how to have very credible, how to have very well-respected certifications in the Agile space. And just recently in September, PMI updated the certifications for Disciplined Agile with their Agile certification journey map. So that's something that, just at the end of the presentation, I'd be happy to answer any questions from a certification perspective as well. So how Disciplined Agile approaches all of these various practices is that it essentially creates an umbrella to be able to say when and what we might want to use, and to make it very clear. So we have a very nice arrangement in Disciplined Agile that we'll look at today, which are called process goals, which have decision points and all of these various options from either a practice or a technique perspective. And it makes it very understandable from a trade-off perspective when some of these might work well and when some of them might not. So a lot of these practices on their own can be quite valuable. But based on the factors that your particular team might be facing, technical complexity, domain complexity, the size of the team, the location of the team, the experience level of the team, are team members brand new to an Agile way of working? Are some team members using an existing Agile approach, but they're not doing it as it's intended, right? All of those types of factors are put into some of the guidance that provides what we call a guided continuous improvement approach, where a lot of the heavy lifting for understanding how these practices can be combined, or when a team might want to experiment with them, based on real project teams throughout the world over a relatively long period of time now. So it's a very simplistic way to get to a lot of information. So the other thing about frameworks is that they're not silver bullets. A lot of times, what if your staff isn't sufficiently skilled, right? Not all organizations have invested in an organizational transformation program as a solid adoption roadmap that combines a certain level of training combined with coaching from a whole team perspective, one-on-one mentoring from an individual, or maybe a one-on-two perspective. And when we are left with just a single framework, it's not something that's going to remove some of those challenges. What if the prescriptive advice doesn't suit your organization's context, right? So what we're finding in a lot of the new PMI Disciplined Agile certification workshops is that a lot of students that are coming in that have had experience or at least exposure to Scrum. I mean, Scrum is the most prevalent Agile way of working that's out in the industry. It doesn't always fit, and Scrum is very prescriptive, right? And the Scrum guide being a very small very focused body of knowledge. It's 17, 18 pages long. So it's not super robust, but it does articulate very specific things that you should be doing. And some of the organizations like scrum.org, if you've had an opportunity to either go through the training or read through some of their material, they describe here's what Scrum is, and it's a small circle on a whiteboard, and then everything else is not Scrum. And then they put a little dot inside of the small circle and say, this is professional Scrum. So there are very specific ways that Scrum is intended, at least from a starting point perspective, to be used. And what if you don't need to do better than simply copying somebody else's approach? So there isn't one way that fits everyone, right? Whether that's from a team perspective, again, a value stream perspective, or an organization perspective. And that's a big differentiator with Disciplined Agile. There is not a single instance of it. There is a wealth of information in the toolkit that teams are intended to choose their own way of working. Now, there might be some things based on the type of organization, the type of product that you're supporting, the level of compliance or regulatory nature, or just the governance that might be over the work that you're doing. But within or outside of some of those perspectives, from a DA, what DA promotes is that teams should be able to choose what works best for them, because that's what we want out of self-organizing teams. So this graph is intended to show just what you might be able to get when you're going to adopt a new way of working, and it is a very prescriptive approach. That we're typically going to see this J-curve. There's going to be a bit of a dip in your effectiveness or your efficiency. Again, you're spending time learning how to do something new, especially if you're moving from a traditional way of working to move to an iterative or a continuous flow type of way of working. It's going to be a significant change. So once you start getting some experience and making some progress, the expectation is things are going to get better. You will come out of this and be more effective. The challenge is when you hit the limits of the framework. So again, Scrum being a very small body of knowledge, teams that were to follow the Scrum guide and do it very effectively would get to a point where to go beyond that level of effectiveness, they would have to look to start doing things outside of what's within Scrum. Some of the data that we're finding, this was from 1,500 plus Agile teams at over 150 organizations, is just some of the productivity ranges based on frameworks. So again, with Scrum being the backbone of a lot of the scaling frameworks like SAFe or large scale Scrum, it's taking teams that have gotten some level of experience and maturity, hopefully using Scrum, and then they are tightly banding those teams together to bring a teams approach. So they're still using Scrum as the basic building block. What we have with Disciplined Agile is a bit different. So what we want is start wherever you are, do the best that you can in the situation you face, and always try to get better. And that's what the body of knowledge in Disciplined Agile brings. And the two green lines here are intended to represent continuous improvement absolutely can occur on teams that are starting with a prescriptive framework, right? If they've got team members or they have a team level coach, whether it's a scrum master or it's some other role name that has experience and can take a look at what types of experiments the team might want to do next from a practice perspective, we would see that they would start to make additional improvements from an efficiency perspective. What we have with Disciplined Agile is the guided continuous improvement, because a lot of this has been at least distilled down into the body of knowledge where you can go to and get quite a bit of understanding of where some of the practices may or may not work. And then where some of the larger decisions that teams might make moving from one life cycle to another one, which again is another key differentiator of DA. We've got multiple life cycles that we can choose from. So it's a very significant decision to move from an iterative based life cycle, something again similar to Scrum, to something that is more like Scrum, Scrumban or Kanban. a lean-based life cycle that is focused on flow and no longer uses a time box construct. So some of the key differentiators of Disciplined Agile versus, again, the other prevalent frameworks in the industry is contains the best of the other frameworks as well as its own developed content. Lean governance focused and a risk value life cycle. So the risk value life cycle is something that is just a tremendous focus when we're working with teams to adopt DA initially, where again, something like Scrum has the product owner prioritize the work items in the backlog. And by doing that, risk is treated as sort of an output of that. From a Disciplined Agile perspective, in what we teach is that we want to use risk as a primary consideration. So we want to identify technical risk specifically and address that very early in the life cycle, right? We want to make sure that we're on really solid footing to be able to move beyond the initial work that we're doing so that we don't find a lot of the things that happen with traditional projects, right? Where some of the harder more challenging aspects are put off to late in the project life cycle. And then there's a lot of rework and scrap and missed expectations, potentially. Multiple life cycles are supported with Disciplined Agile. I'll give a brief overview of the 6 project-based or team-based life cycles, and I'll give a little indication of some of the ones outside of those 6. Strategies and guidance to evolve from a basic Agile lifecycle to increasingly advanced. Again, there are strategies in place so that teams new to an Agile way of working can start with a very Scrum-like approach using the Agile lifecycle, and then move beyond that to something that is more advanced when they're ready, and it'll potentially provide value to them. Advanced certifications based on knowledge and experience. So again, this is something that has just been refactored by PMI with respect to the DA certifications. So there is an entry-level certification with a course that's called the Disciplined Agile Scrum Master. That is a 2-day course, and then there is a challenging exam that you need to pass to be able to earn that designation. Beyond that, all of the additional certifications, Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master, Disciplined Agile Coach, and Disciplined Agile Value Stream Consultant, is a combination of a very challenging exam and an experience requirement. And that experience is actually checked. So that is something that brings a lot more respect to these certifications. It's something that has been part of the Disciplined Agile certification since the initial release of Disciplined Agile. And therefore, we do see a lot of stock put into the certifications in the DA space that individuals have. So from a what makes up Disciplined Agile perspective, again, the proven strategies from a lot of the industry-leading frameworks. So some of them are Scrum, right? So Scrum and the Agile life cycle, or the Agile life cycle and Disciplined Agile, extends Scrum's construction focus. So it uses the best parts of Scrum and fills some of the gaps that Scrum, the Scrum Guide, intentionally open for people to figure out. It also brings in a lot of the enterprise concerns that we don't typically see, at least initially with Scrum, unless we've got Scrum Masters that do have quite a bit of experience. Extreme programming, a lot of the technical practices are coming from XP. There is a program lifecycle, which uses a teams of teams approach, which again, can be configured to be very similar to SAFe or large scale Scrum or Scrum at Scale from scrum.org and so forth. So there is scaling components that are in this. The PMBOK guide, right? So that's something that we're seeing more and more integration between the bodies of knowledge within PMI and what can be brought into DA and vice versa. Kanban, Agile modeling and Agile data, the lean startup, and lots of DevOps information. So one of the things what isn't on this particular graphic is also the unified process. I don't know if anybody has used or had exposure to the varying flavors of unified process, which would be, close to a decade ago. But the Rational Unified Process, which was what IBM owned, the Open Unified Process, the open source version of it, the Enterprise Unified Process, and so forth. So what's interesting about the leadership, the thought leadership in the industry right now is the CEO and product owner of Scrum.org is a gentleman named Dave West, and Dave was a product owner of the Rational Unified Process. Dean Leffingwell had a company that was acquired by Rational, and after IBM acquired the Rational company, Dean led the Rational University for a number of years before he moved on and created SAFe. And Scott Ambler, one of the co-creators of Disciplined Agile, has written more books on the unified process than I think any other person in the world. So there's a lot of shared experience and thoughts within these very prevalent approaches that are in the industry. And again, the thing that I've really enjoyed about Disciplined Agile is that it's very open to what works from these other approaches, and therefore DA is constantly evolving. Right? So every time there's a new release of DA, and there's a core amount of content that just works, and it works really well, and that is quite stable. But they're always looking to incorporate what's working and what new emerging techniques or practices can be incorporated into the toolkit to provide additional options. Another thing is Disciplined Agile does cover an end-to-end perspective, right? So you really need to be able to address all the inherent complexities in the work that you're doing. So what we see with Disciplined Agile, and we see with the 3 phases of the Agile life cycle and the Lean life cycle that I'll touch on in just a few minutes, is that there are inputs to the larger quantities of work that we would still have as, a project, or the next increment of the product that we want to be able to provide value on. And Disciplined Agile covers this work from beginning to end. So there is some upfront planning work we typically do in the inception phase, which for teams that use Scrum, a lot of times this is referred to as Sprint 0. And we get into the construction phase where we're actually doing all of our development work, or configuring our package application, or just working on the things that are part of it if it's not software development. And then we have a transition phase, which gets us ready to release that into the hands of our production environment or hands of our users. Provides contextual best practices, contextual practices, not prescriptive best practices. Again, what we might start with, for one quantity of work might be very different for the next one that we're going to move on to. And addresses all aspects of product delivery, not just software development. So again, we're talking about things that are in the DevOps space, the value stream management space, as well as the enterprise. And finally, strategies for a full range of risks and issues that we're going to run into. So again, that risk value life cycle is something that's very important for us to get value from, right? We want to treat risk as a primary consideration, and we want to focus on it very early in our life cycles. So Disciplined Agile is described by 4 views. And the first view is mindset. So here we have our principles and our guidelines. So one of the favorite quotes that I like to talk about in the certification workshops is that culture will eat strategy for breakfast every day. And a big part of what we need to be successful with any new way of working, let alone adopting Disciplined Agile, is to make sure that we have got buy-in and we're seeing good progress with the mindset of not only the development team members, but our stakeholders and everybody that's connected to that work. The next view is people, and this is where we have roles and responsibilities and team structures. So again, we have a process goal in Disciplined Agile called Form Team, and we have lots of guidance and options that we would consider for how a team or how teams will be formed, how they'll be put together, how they'll be either long-lasting, hopefully, right? Product-based teams or long-lasting teams versus project-based teams that are formed just for a single quantity of work and so forth. We have another view for practices. This is our goal diagrams. So this is where we find the body of knowledge, again, from the practices and techniques perspective, and the information about what that practice is and what types of trade-offs there might be if we want to use it. And finally, flow. This is our life cycles and our workflows. From a mindset perspective, the principles of Disciplined Agile. So principles, promises, and guidelines. So I'm gonna cover the next slide. I'm gonna cover these principles. There are 8 of them, and I'll give a little context because it just provides a good overview of really what Disciplined Agile is founded upon. In addition to that, we have promises and we have guidelines. Unfortunately, in such a short overview like this, I can't cover all of this, but these are covered quite a bit more in depth in the Disciplined Agile Scrum Master course. So again, something else to look into a little bit more. So the principles of Disciplined Agile, the first one is context counts. And again, I've already been talking about this. The context of the next quantity of work, that next increment of value a team is going to be working on and delivering is going to be different each time, right? The level of experience that the team has is going to be different. Maybe the area within the product that they're working in, the types of stakeholders or the types of users or user groups that value is going to be tied to is going to be different. Maybe we have a team member that's rolled off or a new one that's rolled on, right? Again, we've got 6 factors that are called the tactical scaling factors in DA. And 2 of them are the technology complexity and the domain complexity, and that has a big impact from a context perspective. The next principle is choice is good. So we don't have one way of doing things. We will make decisions, and we don't have to stick to those decisions once we've made them from an initial perspective. Right? So teams are going to make some initial decisions when they begin using DA the first time, but they're not locked into that forever, whether that's the life cycle that they select or an individual practice that they select. We always want to be able to have options from a choice perspective. Be pragmatic, right? What we don't want to do is follow a prescriptive approach, follow an approach that another team has been using. We want to be able to make decisions based on the reality of the context that we face. Organize around products and services. Again, what we're seeing more and more through organizations is they're trying to move more towards these long-lasting teams. There are some detriments with a long-lasting team, but the positives typically are going to far outweigh that. So we want to be starting to organize around that, organize around not only our products, but our value streams. Optimize flow. We don't want to be making just localized decisions. We don't want teams to be very high performing at the cost of other teams. We want to do our best to minimize dependencies, but that's not always possible. So we want to make sure that the decisions that we're making, the direction we're going from a team perspective or a product perspective is going to be able to help to optimize the flow across the entire organization, or again, across how we're delivering in our value streams. Enterprise awareness, right? So what we want to be very cognizant of is the types of guidelines and standards and best practices and approaches. We want to know how we're affecting other parts of the organization. So enterprise awareness is another significant part of Disciplined Agile. Be awesome. What we find with respect to all Agile ways of working is teams are typically going to be happier. Right. I mean, one of the things that's across all Agile ways of working is that teams should be not only cross-functional, but they should be self-organizing. They should be empowered to make decisions. If they're using a prescriptive framework, there's only going to be so much that they're going to be able to make decisions on. And so the Be Awesome principle within DA goes beyond that, because teams, based on their context and being pragmatic, can make their own choices. And finally, if we do all that, we delight customers, right? So we meet and exceed their expectations, whether they're our stakeholders, they're our ultimate customers. So these are the 8 principles that Disciplined Agile is really founded upon. They're all quite important. I've left these, and they're in no particular order when you look at them in Disciplined Agile. I have ordered them, and the way that I covered them are a bit on how I typically work with organizations and then work with teams. And these 3 to me are the ones that they're all important. These would be the most important. Context counts, be pragmatic, and choice is good. These are again the biggest differentiators in my experience that DA offers to teams and organizations. So the next view is people, roles, responsibilities, and team structure. So we have primary roles and we have supporting roles within Disciplined Agile. The primary roles, starting with the team lead, again, very similar to a Scrum Master, Agile process expert, keeps the team focused on achievement of goals, removes impediments. Product owner owns the product vision and the scope and priorities of the solution. So again, very, very similar to what we'd find in Scrum. I will say one of the differences with the team lead versus a Scrum Master, as it's written in the Scrum Guide, is that the team lead we'd want to see has experience and has some awareness of the Agile lifecycle. Again, that extends Scrum, and that is where the majority of most teams new to Agile are more than likely going to start. But a team lead also needs to have an understanding of the lean life cycle and the other life cycles that are within Disciplined Agile. So there is a bit of a difference in what we would consider a team lead versus a Scrum Master. And the new certifications are Disciplined Agile Scrum Master, Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master. Those are designations versus a role name like team lead. The next one, the architect owner owns the architecture decisions, technical priorities, mitigates key technical risks. This role is unique from a DA perspective, and I'm going to cover this one in a little bit more depth next. But this is how we are providing something from a role perspective that really helps with that risk value life cycle, right? Where we want the product owner to really understand business value and all the perspectives that they need to take into consideration when prioritizing the items on the backlog. But oftentimes they're not going to have a deep expertise in the technical space. And so what DA has from a primary role perspective on their teams is this architect owner role that helps to focus on that. And then we have team members, right? Again, no different than any other Agile way of working, cross-functional team members that deliver the solution, and our stakeholders, right? It includes a customer, but also many other stakeholders that we have to interact with, right? Sponsor, operations, support staff, enterprise architecture, database groups, and so forth. So I'll spend just a little bit more time on this architect owner role. So the architect owner is typically filled by whoever that most senior technical person on the team is, most senior developer. It's not intended to be filled from somebody else, typically outside the team. So if you're in an organization and you have an enterprise architecture type of department, it's not a point of contact from enterprise architecture. The person filling this role is intended to be an actual team member. So it's an explicit role to guide the team through architecture and design decisions. So identify technical stories, right, which can be called spikes, enabler stories, etc. Right. So these are things that we want on our backlog potentially as well. We want to have the things that are going to need to be done to provide the functionality or that other value that the scope of the work is intended to deliver. This role is intended to work very closely with enterprise architects if you have that. Collaborates with the product owner on technical stakeholder needs, focuses on minimizing technical debts, understands existing enterprise assets, and has final say regarding technical decisions. So the product owner is still the single role that is responsible for prioritizing the backlog or the work items pool, however we're going to manage our requirements. But the architect owner is intended to have the final decision on technical things. And we should see a very close collaboration between the architect owner and the product owner. So how it works is the architect owner is also a team member, right? Unless there is such complexity and technical risk on a quantity of work that the team is getting ready to work on, this role is intended to be filled by an individual that would spend a certain amount of their capacity as the architect owner, and the rest of their time is going to be as a team member. So an example would be, we might have our next quantity of work. Maybe we're taking an existing product and we're going to replatform it to a new technology. That would be typically have quite a bit of risk. So we might see that 75% of the capacity of the person filling this role is going to be in that architect owner role and fulfilling the responsibilities there. The remainder of the time, 25% might be on just doing work, taking on some of the work. I'm sorry, does somebody have a question? Nope. Okay. The next thing we might find is maybe, 2 or 3 releases down the road that there's minimal technical risk, right? So there's, more and more functionality that we're configuring or building, but we have very little technical risk because there's still a focus that we'd want for the person filling the architect owner role, but it'd be a lot less, and they would just be then performing as a team member, taking on work as appropriate. And in practice, how this is intended to work is the product owner is focused on building the right product, right? So if we're doing things in smaller and smaller batches, we're getting feedback from our stakeholders, we're getting feedback from the marketplace, right? How our customers are responding to the functionality that we're putting out. The product owner is always focused on building the product right and using that information to make more and more informed decisions. The architect owner is focused on building the product right. So we want to make sure that we have very good technical practices. We're focused on paying down technical debt if we have it, or avoiding technical debt when we can, or taking on technical debt if it's something that is the right decision because we need to get out into the marketplace, and then paying that debt down as quickly as possible. The team lead is focused on delivering the product sooner, right? They're there to help the enablement of achieving business agility with the expertise that they bring from an agile process expert perspective. So we should see not only a high level of collaboration, especially between the product owner and the architect owner, but we should see some healthy tension, right? We want to see that there is a focus on that technical risk and the architect owner making the case for why that should be prioritized high and why we should focus on it. So now we are on to practices, so our goal diagrams. So what Disciplined Agile has is it has 21 process goals that are just containers of information at the team level. They are organized by the phases that are associated with our Agile and Lean lifecycle: inception, construction, and transition. And then we have ongoing, which is goals and practices that would be there for something we would just be doing perpetually. So how these containers of information work is that the process goals that were represented on the left, which were tied to inception, form team, align with enterprise direction, explore scope, and so forth, things that we would be doing very early in our life cycle, have decision points. Right? So the decision points are there for the team to consider how they're going to address some of these aspects. Now, not all 21 of those process goals may be of critical importance for a team. A team might look at all 21. It might look at the ones that they are going to potentially have the highest impact for the next quantity of work that they're going to do. And the same thing with the decision points. And what we have with decision points is we have lots of options, right? So Well, what I have up top coming out of the orange box that says decision point is we have option, 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 and the middle one, which is bolded, is a default option. So there are some recommendations for relatively small teams with straightforward context to have as a good starting point. Some of the options are ordered, and that's what's on the lower part with that orange arrow. So we might start with something like work items list and continue to move up in options as we get some experience to something that would be more akin to a work item pool. And typically we'd be using a work item pool when we'd be using the lean life cycle. Another example would be explore usage, right? So how are we going to explore the usage? Well, epics and user stories and user story maps are the bolded decisions there. So if you think back to the slide that I started off with that said, there's hundreds and hundreds of practices that you can find from an agile and lean perspective in the varying bodies of knowledge or just industry sources. What these process goals do is it arranges them into containers of information that makes it very easy to find and provides some context around what you might want to start with. And then again, the trade-off, which I'm going to show next, as far as how you can make some decisions around that. But to be very clear, although there is a tremendous amount of information within these process goals, what I like to work on is focusing on, context counts. So epic, outcome, persona, all the rest of these. What happens if there's something that is not in this option list that you might find value with your team or your product or even within your given organization? Well, feature. Feature is one of those that comes up a lot. There's a certain context when somebody says, yes, we have a feature level requirement, might be considered a super high level epic. It's something that we might break down into epics and stories, and then those epics get, broken down either by splitting or possibly by reducing the acceptance criteria around them. So we can add it in. And again, typically want to do this pretty sparingly at organizations, at least when we first start. Again, there's a lot of good guidance already in DA, but it's not intended, again, to be followed just as the gospel, right? We want to be able to use context counts and be pragmatic. We might have some of these options that wouldn't be applicable for our organization, again, based on the type of work that we do or the type of compliance that we have to be in alignment with. So we might see some of these options removed, and we might see some other ones put in. Again, we'd want to be sparing with that, but that's something that we should be very aware of. So this goal-driven approach, comprehensive, well-organized toolkit of strategies to help your organization be more successful with Agile. So here's what one of the process goals look like: develop common vision, capture the vision, expected outcomes, business canvas, vision statement, and so forth. And what we find in the Choose Your Way of Working book or an online tool that Disciplined Agile has looks like what I have over here to the right? It gives a brief description of what each one of these practices is, and then it also provides some trade-offs. So this makes it a lot easier for teams new to an agile way of working to have a body of knowledge they can go to and understand. Again, it's still a pretty high level when they might want to use this or even what a particular practice means. And by doing this, we find, understanding what your options are and which ones work in different contexts leads to better decisions. So this is part of the guided continuous approach to DA and why its body of knowledge is organized the way that it is. And the last view is the flow view, and teams should choose an appropriate life cycle. This is really one of the highest level decisions a team can make because it's how they're going to organize delivering that next increment of value that they're going to produce. So at the team level, there are 6 life cycles: Agile, continuous delivery Agile, Lean and continuous delivery Lean, Exploratory, and Program. In addition to this, there are life cycles that are evolutions of, for instance, Agile and Lean that are focused on non-software development work. There is the Flex life cycle, which gets into value stream management, and again, the portfolio level decision making. And what we have from a lean governance perspective is we have these 3 phases, and we have some lightweight milestones associated with them. So these 3 phases and the milestones are the same for the Agile life cycle, which again extends Scrum, and the Lean life cycle. So what we want to do, and the inception and transition phases, we want to do whatever's required to meet the essence of those milestones. But we want to do it in the shortest time frame possible. And as teams get more and more experience, we find that the inception and transition phases, the time required to do them shrink. Right. So again, inception, very similar to the concept of sprint zero. We're doing a little bit of upfront planning and decision making before we commit to a certain quantity of work that we're going to ultimately develop or complete in the construction phase. And then transition, especially when we're able to make some inroads into automation, we have some, we're focusing on sort of the DevOps aspects. This can essentially be brought down to a series of activities. But we have these milestones. So stakeholder vision is what we look to do before we get out of inception, right? We've got good agreement by our stakeholders on the higher level scope the team is getting ready to commit to. We have a good understanding of risk and how we're going to mitigate it. We have an initial release plan. We forecasted, if we're using the Agile lifecycle, how many iterations we're going to need, how many time boxes we're going to need in the construction phase. And we're able to set expectations that we can then manage across the rest of the life cycle. As we get into construction phase, we have our first milestone called proven architecture, which is, have we done a good job at mitigating technical risk and put us in a good position to then continue on and build the rest of the quantity of work on solid footing, right? And where this particular milestone, proven architecture, is within the construction phase is going to vary. Again, when I was covering the architect owner role in that other slide and kind of showing the capacity, if the the person playing the architect owner role was spending 75% of their time because of all of the technical risk that the next quantity of work posed, we would typically see proven architecture milestone somewhere, in the mid to latter part of construction potentially. If we've got very little technical risk, we've got a quantity of work that is not going to be an impact to our existing architecture. Typically, it's going to be pretty early. Continued viability, right? Again, based on feedback that we're getting from our stakeholders through our product owner, should we continue to do this? When we hit our sufficient functionality, right? Have we hit the minimum of what we need to be able to release that next increment of value into the hands of our users, our customers, and they'll actually get value from it? And then finally, we move into transition, make sure we've got good production readiness, and then we release that next quantity of work. How this works in the life cycles is, right, the Agile life cycle. Again, this is kind of these diagrams are very robust. So again, I'm going to take us through them rather quickly just to show you a little bit about what these life cycles are intended to accomplish. So in the construction phase, this part here should look very familiar to anybody who has used Scrum, right? This is very similar to the Scrum lifecycle, right? Which is, we've got a time box and we're going to commit to doing a certain amount of work in that time box, so whatever that period is, anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. 2 weeks is pretty common for new teams. We are going to take a look at our daily work through our daily coordination meeting, which is very similar to the daily Scrum. We're going to hopefully get all of the work we committed to done, and we're going to move into our next iteration and our next iteration. Again, from a inception standpoint, we've got some inputs: portfolio management, product management, enterprise architecture are just some of the things that might be an input to getting us to what that next increment of value we're going to produce. And then when we get to the transition phase, we're making sure that we're in good position to actually release it. So this is a typical starting point for teams that are going to move into an Agile way of working. It's a good life cycle for teams that have been using Scrum because it brings some additional options available to them so that maybe they can move from whatever level of efficiency and productivity that they've been able to get to and move beyond that. The next life cycle is the continuous delivery version of this. So this is a much more advanced life cycle. You can see what we've got here is there's no inception, there's no transition, but you can see the milestones that we had in the transition phase are still there. And the intent of this life cycle is that at the end of every iteration, we would potentially be uh, doing a release into our production environment. So we're still using time boxes, we're still using, an iteration as our construct, and we're still going to have a small batch of work, right? Whatever we can do in that time period. Typically 1 to 2 weeks is usual with this. To do this, especially for new functionality, it takes quite a bit of experience. This is an advanced life cycle, quite a bit of automation. For some areas of the organization, this might be where they start, your operations area, right? If they're doing break fix, they're typically already doing something in a very short time period, right? In a week or two, they're typically taking on some quantity of work that they're going to release. So for teams that are in the operational or maintenance area, this is a good life cycle that potentially would fit them. If it's teams that are doing new functionality, that might be a different discussion because there's a little bit more complexity associated with that. The lean life cycle is based on flow, right? So it's very similar. It uses to the agile life cycle, it uses the underlying governance structure. The most significant difference here is we're no longer using iterations, right? Or time boxes. What we're looking to do here is focus on flow. Teams that are very, if they're using Scrum and they're very effective, maybe they've considered moving to, what's known as Scrumban or just a Kanban approach. This is a really good spot for them to evolve to if they're looking to take on Disciplined Agile. So one thing I do want to, I know we're getting kind of close on time, and I want to wrap this up so we can get into some Q&A quickly. But with DA, again, in my experience, I've worked with SAFe, I've worked with Scrum, and I've done a lot of work with organizations adopting DA. You can start with Disciplined Agile as your initial way of working if you're moving from some other approach, again, typically a more traditional approach. So you don't have to start with Scrum and then move to something within DA. It's a great starting point. But if you're already using another approach with your team, your organization, DA typically can bring lots of options that you might either not have had available to you, or maybe didn't know that you could be choosing from. There is the continuous delivery lean life cycle. This is really advanced. So this is where, a team is selecting work, and you might have a story, a work item that gets to the point where it's, implemented, it meets the definition of done, and it could be released. You might have a few stories that need to be aggregated together to be able to release. But this life cycle enables very, very rapid deployment or very, very regular deliveries into a production environment. The exploratory lean startup life cycle, this is where we are taking an idea and seeing maybe if we can productize it or monetize it. So this is where we're doing innovative type work. It's a very small life cycle intended to produce results to know if we should keep going in that direction. And finally, the program lifecycle, and this could be easily an hour or two webinar all on its own. So this is where we have a teams of teams approach. And what I do want to just leave as a takeaway for you is that you could configure Disciplined Agile using the program lifecycle to be very similar to, say, for large-scale Scrum. Right? You can make those options from a practice perspective, even PI planning, are in DA, and you could do that. However, what you could do is you could look at your teams and say, do they all need to be banded that tightly? Do they all need to be using the exact same practices? Do they all need to be using even the same life cycle? So the program life cycle and the strategies within DA open up lots of opportunities when we do have a teams of teams approach and possibilities that are, again, a bit unique, and why, why DA is got a bit of a differentiator there. The last thing that I will conclude with is, when a team makes a selection for one of these life cycles, do they pick it and they're stuck with it forever? Absolutely not. We want teams to be able to experiment and possibly move back and forth between the life cycles, again, based on the type of work that they're doing, based on the makeup of their team, based on a whole litany of factors that we would consider when looking at that context, to be able to see what's the best life cycle for them to be able to deliver that value. And with that, I see that there is a Menti down there for a bit of the feedback for from the session today. And what I'd like to do is just go ahead and open it up to Q&A for the remainder of the time that we have.
Thank you, Joshua. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So around slide 29 or 30, you mentioned about some tools we can use to pick the Disciplined Agile framework options. Can you give us some details around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a tool called the DA browser, and it is accessible via the Disciplined Agile Consortium. To get access to that, you have to be a member of the consortium, and that has changed very recently. So one way is I believe if you are a PMI member, you can get access to the consortium now. And there is a bit of a transition period going on because of the new certifications and the new ATP program, and all the DA partners are now becoming ATPs, just like REPs have become ATPs. So we're in a little bit of a transition period right now. The other way, which is historically how you got it, is you came to a certification workshop and then you became a Disciplined Agile Consortium member, and you were provided access to all the resources in the consortium. So there are some, if you're a guest, you don't have an account, you're able to get to some of the information in the consortium. Once you're a member, you have access to everything. And the DA web browser is one of them. And that's so again, the graph that was, or the image that was up there, the browser enables you to have a more dynamic view into the process goal content versus what you'd find in the Choose Your Wow book. It works really well. That's been a benefit of being a member of the consortium for a number of years now. And in the future, I think the goal is that organizations and then teams can go in and use the browser and have an instance of DA configured for them that they might use for that next quantity of work. And then we'd want to see that different options are being chosen, because we want to have a learning mindset and always do continuous guided improvement. So it's not meant to be done once and and remain static. But yeah, in the future, there's going to be more robust functionality that comes out.
I think there's a question in the chat room. How do you define DA as a methodology, approach, process, tool?
Yeah, so another good question. It's considered a toolkit because it is highly configurable, right? We have so many options we can choose from. So it's not really a methodology. It's definitely not a framework. It used to be referred to as a framework, but as it evolved, especially a couple of years ago when the Disciplined Agile Delivery Handbook, the second generation, was Choose Your Way of Working. The best way to describe it is a toolkit and a decision-based approach.
Thank you.
Can you talk more about the certification processes and the various certifications that might be available?
Yes. So there is a new graphic that was released that it looks a little bit like a molecule. Some say it looks like a Ferris wheel. So the initial certification is called the Disciplined Agile Scrum Master. So if we said, where the entry point is, it would be there. You have a 2-day workshop, you have a challenging exam you take, and you can achieve Disciplined Agile Scrum Master. The next DA1 is the Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master, and sort of as another entry point into that is if you have your ACP. So if you have it or you want to become an ACP, you can do that, and your next step would be the Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master. You don't have to go back and take the Scrum Master course. The DASSM is a senior or an advanced certification. It is a very challenging exam combined with an experience check. So that is a 2-day course. The initial release for that is scheduled to be early December. So we should be seeing that somewhat soon. My expectation is that you'll start to see workshops available for that in early January. In Q1 of 2021, we should see the Disciplined Agile Coach. So there was a certified Disciplined Agile Coach designation. There was a 2-day workshop that was associated with that. And then you had to have a fair amount of, again, validated experience, and there was a panel interview. That has now been transitioned into what's just called the Disciplined Agile Coach. I think that is still intended to be a 3-day workshop. I think it's a minimum of 3 years of validated coaching experience and a very, very challenging exam. And then the final one is going to be the Disciplined Agile Value Stream Consultant. That's the program that Al Shalloway and a lot of the body of knowledge from Net Objectives is working on. There was an alpha program this year that concluded about a month ago. That will be a program that is intended for very experienced consultants that'll help organizations use the Flex life cycle. That's going to be a 3-day workshop combined with probably the most challenging certification exam, along with experience. And you have to be, I think, a minimum Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master to be able to go forward with that one. I don't think you have to be a coach. And the other thing is that there is recognition of other professional certifications. So if you're a SAFe SPC, your path would really be right into the Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master role. And the reason why we need that before going into coach, because there's a lot of context in that around DA and how to use the toolkit that, again, if you've got a certification, you've been doing something like SAFe, you probably don't have the awareness of what DA brings. But you don't have to start off at the very entry point like the Scrum Master one.
Thank you.
Yep.
It may be a repetitive kind of question, but I think you mentioned that if you have the ACP, you can just go direct to the DA Scrum Master.
Senior Scrum Master. DA Senior Scrum Master.
Okay.
Yeah, DA Senior Scrum Master. Yeah, you don't have to take the DA Scrum Master. I will say that if you have gotten your ACP, there are things that we have found. We have found that some of the students we've had in our workshops, amongst other ATPs, that sometimes the results on the exam would have benefited from going to the initial 2 days. So there used to be a Foundations of Agile, Foundations of Lean, and then a 2-day, what was called Disciplined Agile Lean Scrum Master course. So there are times where we've talked with people that have their ACP designation, depending on when they got it, how long ago it was, what type of experience they have with an agile way of working. Sometimes the recommendation is you would probably benefit from taking either the DASM, or there are other, there are agile and lean boot camps. The company that I work for, we have an agile and lean boot camp that is a step that a lot of people take before they either did the DA-LSM workshop or before they're doing the DASM. So there are lots of options, and I would say talk to one of the instructors, and they can probably point you to what would be just the best options for you, and a little more information so you can make a good decision.
Thank you.
Hey, Joshua, I sent a question to the chat room. It seems like the lean life cycle is more suitable to the waterfall project.
Not necessarily. So the lean life cycle. So there's pros and cons or, positives and detriments to either the agile life cycle or the lean one. The agile life cycle, in my experience, is the best starting point for teams that are moving from a traditional or a waterfall approach, because that time box provides good visibility into if the team is actually making good progress on an agile way of working. It's not that you can't do that with a more Kanban or lean life cycle approach, but it sometimes benefits teams to have a bit of that structure, to having a recurring iteration, just like Scrum, right? We have iteration planning, we have look ahead modeling and planning, we've got, backlog refinement, we've got iteration review, iteration retrospective, and then our daily coordination meetings. And we're doing that in a certain time box, right? Again, typically 2 weeks. So 2 weeks over 2 weeks over 2 weeks. With a time box, it's much easier to see if the team is committed to doing a certain quantity of work, and that quantity of work met their definition of done. With the lean life cycle, that still can obviously be done. It's just a little bit more challenging. So normally, or I should say almost always, my recommendation is start with the agile life cycle. And if the team's doing it really well and we're finding that they're able to get through each iteration very, very successfully, we can always transition to the lean life cycle at any time. Now, there's overhead with doing that, but the underlying structure from a governance perspective, those 3 phases and milestones are the same for both of those life cycles. So if you were moving from traditional to an agile or lean way of working, I would recommend starting with agile and moving on from there.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 2 more questions, so let's go ahead and answer those 2, then we can wrap up the meeting. I know we are a little past the 10:30 already. So there are 2 questions here, Joshua. One is, which industry are showing more interest to implement DA?
We're seeing, so PMI has raised the awareness of DA to a level that was never achieved prior to the acquisition. So so our company, we're seeing it in a whole multitude of organizations, healthcare, things in finance, nonprofits. I'm trying to think of some of the current transformations we're working on. In addition to that, in our certification workshops, we're seeing more attendance from non-software development areas. Construction and mining are 2 of the more prevalent ones, and construction in particular. I spoke at a conference earlier this week, and it was on specifically on agile and lean principles in the construction industry, both residential and commercial construction. So there's a lot of interest there. Utilities is another one. Energy and utility companies, we're seeing quite a bit of interest in. So it's across the board.
Okay, great, thank you.
And what was the other question?
Yeah, where can we see the training offered by you?
So
after this.
yes, so you can go out to the Process Mentors website. That is one space. We've got all of our PMI workshops that are up there. And again, everybody's in a transition period because of the new workshops, but our boot camps are up there, our Agile and Lean boot camp. Our transformation strategy, which is based on one of the other books that's part of DA, the Executive Handbook, chapter 7 talks about a lean transition roadmap. And what we've got is we also have just-in-time training. So a lot of the practices that you see within the process goals, a little bit that I showed you here, that DA teaches you all about choosing your way of working. But what we have is we've got a series of trainings that are for doing your way of working. So when we work with teams and we provide coaching and adoption services support, we have very small, very focused training sessions that might be anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the practice, done just in time before the team would then do that next thing. So DA doesn't teach you how to do iteration planning, right? We've got a 40-minute training module for that. And then there's no exercise or sort of fictitious sample. The team goes in and does iteration planning. So we also have that available as well.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua. Just a quick announcement. So our next breakfast planning will be January 2021. The website does not have the speakers or the topic information yet. We are in the process of finalizing the detail with the speakers. So once we have it done, we're going to be updated on the web. Okay, so thank you. So Martin, anything else before we end the call?
Yeah, just please go ahead, take a few minutes to complete the survey. That's really will help us to provide more good topic and bring good speaker like Joshua to for 2021 event, even for the future event. So we really appreciate everybody, spend your time Saturday with us. And thank you, Joshua, for your great presentation. And I think everybody enjoyed very much to get more into the DA umbrella. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you everyone for coming too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. You got us a lot to chew on. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.